Sony had to make this project that was based on a Nintendo prototype their own, to differentiate it and to create and foster its own personality, make it powerful and make it look good while doing it. Teyu Goto first set out to design the PlayStation console. Many CD players use disc trays. Teyu took this design and created a rectangular box with a cylinder in the middle to complement the disc format, with 3 smaller circles to the left and right for reset, power and eject. The lid was made with thick plastic to protect the inserted disc from the rough and tumble of kids. This was quickly approved by Kutaragi. However, the controller did not have a similar fate, and Goto needed to fight for his ideas. Kutaragi wanted a controller similar to the Famicom controller, but Teyu wanted to innovate. These controllers were fine for small hands and for a small amount of time, but introduced pains for anyone with bigger hands who used the console for an extended amount of time. Teyu wanted a controller that would fit comfortably in the hand. Why not extend it out and create handles? Turn the controller from a flat device for 2D games into a 3D, more versatile controller for the complexities of 3D titles. Teyu wanted every part of the controller to symbolize something. Start became a button that looked much like the play button on a DVD controller. The face buttons became shapes. Controls before the PlayStation would use A, B, X, Y, and 1, 2, 3, 4. There had been nothing creative, and Teyu wanted the controller to be as innovative as the console itself. Teyu stated, "The triangle refers to a viewpoint. I had it represent one's head or direction and made it green. Square refers to a piece of paper. I had it represent menus or documents and made it pink. The circle and X represent yes or no for decision making, and I made them red and blue respectively. People thought those colours were mixed up, and I had to reinforce to management that that's what I wanted. This confusion in colours and shape is why circle is accepted in Asia while it's X in the Western market." Kutaragi hated the controller, regardless of Teyu's explanations. Kutaragi just kept placing extra pressure on Teyu. Teyu had to do something, so he gave Oga his design for the controller, and Oga loved it. He felt it was very Sony, comfortable and worthy of the brand. Kutaragi had the skills when it came down to creating groundbreaking hardware. However, hardware paired with nothing to take advantage of it is hardware that is designed to fail. Maruyama knew that people didn't buy entertainment devices for the hardware, but rather for the experiences that were enabled by the hardware. They needed experiences for the PlayStation to sell. Sony was struggling at the start. Nintendo and Sega both started as game developers. They developed both hardware and software for the arcades. Sony didn't have the software expertise to create breakthrough titles. They had TV tie-in games or music which could work for rhythm games, but actual system sellers? Sony could not provide. So Kutaragi took it on himself to visit every big game company in Japan to sell them on the vision of PlayStation, get contacts and get games. Every company Kutaragi went to, he was told that Sony was pitching the unimaginable and that they were selling snake oil. Sony would have to have the PlayStation out and selling in the millions before these developers would even look at making games for the console. Sony announced Sony Interactive Entertainment, a new business, created half by Sony and half by Sony Music, featuring Kutaragi's demonstration of the PlayStation. A live 3D dinosaur is walking in the center of a screen. Kutaragi pressed some buttons on the controller to make the dinosaur change direction or roar to show that the demonstration is in fact live. The audience was silent. Expecting a round of applause, Kutaragi was in fright. However, it turned out that the audience was too shocked to speak. They were in awe. Nothing they had seen before could replicate this kind of visual splendor, without the price tag being in the thousands. After the demonstration, companies were lining up to talk to Kutaragi and asked how it all worked and what the limitations were of the device. They were interested in developing for the device, but not fully sold on it yet. Developers knew the system would be disc-based, but that brought up some nightmares. The Sega CD and the CDI made the games incredibly slow to load. In comparison to the instant cartridge format, developers didn't want to work with a disc-based system because even if they could create amazing 3D worlds, it means nothing if the audience had to wait several minutes for an area to finish loading. However, Sony had already solved this issue. CDs are faster to produce. They are cheaper. If you don't order enough stock, Sony can get you new prints of the game within 3 days. As where with Nintendo, it will take 3 months to produce a new cartridge order, meaning lost sales if the game becomes a hit. It also means that your losses won't be as high if you overpredict your sales. And when it comes down to loading, the PlayStation 1 has plenty of RAM. Move the important data that needs to be loaded quickly from the disc to the RAM. Then you only need to worry about the CD speed when the data in the RAM needs to be replaced. PlayStation offered revolutionary 3D, a solution to CD slow loading times, faster delivery times for new video game orders, more storage for the games, a cheaper format, and no first-party competition. Everyone was on an equal playing field. To sweeten the deal even more, Sony had purchased Psygnosis. Psygnosis created software libraries and set up support centers in London, California, and Tokyo. This was so that game developers could ask for more assistance at any time. Psygnosis also pioneered a development kit for the Sony PlayStation, named the Psy-Q. It made development for the PlayStation much cheaper, easier, and more accessible to developers. Sony partnered with Namco, Square Enix, Konami, and many more developers. Now that the PlayStation was sold to publishers and developers, and a launch lineup of titles for the PlayStation were being developed, it was time to look at selling these consoles to the general public. Namco had recently released Ridge Racer to the arcades. This was a massive hit. As the game was being enjoyed in the arcades, Namco had announced that Ridge Racer was also going to be released on the Sony PlayStation at launch. Gamers were hyped. There were still debates internally in regards to if the name Sony should be included on the box, as the high officials still didn't want anything to do with the console gaming market. They also feared that it would be a flop, and didn't want the stain to be associated with the Sony brand. Given all the positive signs from the PlayStation hardware itself, the progress with the dev kits, and the partnerships, in the end, the Sony brand was placed on every PlayStation. In Japan, the PlayStation came out on the 3rd of December, so Sony created some adverts, which repeated PlayStation, Ich-ni-san.
123でゲームが変わる。12月3日、プレイステーションを待て。123でゲームが変わる。12月3日、プレイステーションを待て。
123 123でゲームが変わる。123
12月3日、プレイステーションを待て。
In the West, You Are Not Ready was the advertising craze. They reflected a change in tone and culture.
Hello, citizens of Europe. As spokesperson for SAPS, the Society Against PlayStation, I'd like to talk to you about a menace threatening humanity. It's happening right here, in our very homes, and corrupting the lives of our loved ones. Yes, friends, I'm talking about this. It may look like a harmless bagel toaster, but inside is a deadly donut. How do you know PlayStation is not a normal game system? It carries these telltale signs. Scientists say its effects are mind-boggling. Users lose all sense of reality and enter another world. Here we have a normal, healthy young man. And here we have a fellow who's been experimenting with PlayStation for only a few minutes. Proof that we saps must be on our guard. Remember, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.
Let me tell you what bugs me about human endeavour. I've never been the human in question. Have you? Mankind went to the moon. I don't even know where Grimsby is. Forget progress by proxy. Land on your own moon. It's no longer about what they can achieve out there in your behalf, but what we can experience up here in our own time. It's called mental wealth.
Can we have your full name and your title, please?
I'm Phil Harrison, Director of Product Development for Sony Computer Entertainment.
Excellent. Now tell us about the PlayStation. What is it? What does it do?
Okay, here at ECTS we're launching the Sony PlayStation, which is our entrance into the next generation video game marketplace. The PlayStation is an advanced, RISC-based, custom processor machine which delivers stunning performance at a very, very low price.
So, I mean, it gets very technical and all of this sort of thing, but when somebody wants to go out and they think their kid wants a computer game,
right,
how do they know what to buy, whether yours is the one for them?
Well, obviously in the run-up to the launch we'll be making that message very clear, but the consumer will be able to see in store how good the PlayStation is compared to the existing system. So that's a very important part of our strategy, is to get the consumer to come into the stores and see the system when we launch it later this year.
So the system itself is a PlayStation, so it is games?
Correct. The strategy for us is to introduce the PlayStation as the definitive home entertainment system. What that means is that the launch software is going to be almost exclusively video game product. As time goes on, we may broaden the message slightly to include non-game product, but the strategy initially is games only.
So how does this system compare with someone like Sega's Saturn system, which is the games, and the CDI, which does the videos and music and everything else?
Well, you've just raised a very good point there, which is it does everything. And that's a very difficult message to convey to the general public. The focus of our marketing will be that this is a video game system. It delivers the kind of processing power that is normally associated with £10,000 arcade machines, £60,000 graphics workstations. In fact, that's where the name comes from. PlayStation is the power of a workstation for fun and games in the home. So our message is to convey to the consumer that this is the best video game system he can get. The problem with a very broad marketing message, it's interactive cookbooks at one end, or videos or video games, is that you get such a broad, thin marketing message that the consumer gets confused and doesn't really understand what the system is about. Our process is to make sure they absolutely get it from day one.
Ridge Racer was PlayStation's star in Japan and the Americas, with nothing quite like it in the American and Japanese home console market. While there were many racing games on other platforms, many were visually lacking, or those that were visually impressive at the time ran at approximately 20 frames per second, with obvious popping. Ridge Racer was visually stunning and didn't have obvious visual popping. It also ran at a smooth 30 frames per second. The difference was night and day. If that wasn't enough, the game didn't slack in the gameplay department and offered the clearest audio quality. It was clear Ridge Racer was far beyond anything else you could get on any other console at that time. In the European market, the golden game was Wipeout, as Ridge Racer did not play so well on the 50Hz screens that were the standard in the European market. Wipeout also fit into the underground rave culture that PlayStation was marketing itself to in that region. To make the console play games as well as it does, while also being visually impressive and affordable, costs had to be cut somewhere. And that's where PlayStation's biggest charm factor comes from. The PlayStation is well known for having warping textures. This is because the PlayStation doesn't have a Z buffer, which is typically used to calculate depth information. So when textures are applied to the polygons, they are interpreted linearly, resulting in visual distortion. There is also a lack of floating point operations. Integers are used for distance instead, which reduces the precision in polygon rendering, which results in polygon jittering. Issues like this didn't hinder the PlayStation. Every console had to cut corners to keep the price down, but PlayStation was smart about which corners were to be cut, and that would keep them on top of the competition for many years to come. Sony had never sold a console before, so the original plan was to look at how other devices were sold: CD players, Sony Walkman, headphones, etc., to decide on how to price the PlayStation. They came to the conclusion that to sell the console with a small profit, as they would with any other device, they would have to sell the console at $3.99. Retailers would get 25% profit margin. Retailers were related, as Nintendo would only give 10% of the profit margin. Since retailers were getting extra profit from selling the PlayStation, they started pushing the PlayStation to be the console to get. Demo units were set up in every store, with a bountiful collection of PlayStations and game discs available to buy. This was until the stocks ran out. Sony couldn't manufacture enough PlayStations for the holiday season. In the Americas, the console had been announced to cost $299. This meant selling the console at a loss in the Western market, but the price was made up with software sales. It was better to market the console at a loss, so that the Sega Saturn would struggle to get a foothold. This would keep games, developers, and ultimately customers coming to the PlayStation for years to come. The PlayStation was revolutionary, allowing for smooth gameplay, CD quality audio, and games that could load data fast, even from a disc, along with a brand new controller that was far more comfortable to hold and understand than any of the competitors. And all of this released 2 years before their biggest competitor released in Japan, and 1 year before they released in Europe. The Nintendo 64, even though releasing later, was still using cartridges with an upper limit of 64 megabytes. PlayStation built up their brand with culture-defining titles like Twisted Metal, Tomb Raider, and Resident Evil. These titles really pushed the idea that the PlayStation isn't just for the kids, with Twisted Metal's dark humour, Tomb Raider's sex appeal, and Resident Evil's fear factor. While Nintendo had still appeared as a kid's toy, as the Nintendo 64's release came closer, PlayStation made some competitive changes, lowering the price of the PlayStation to match that of the Nintendo 64's launch price. They had also found a 3D platforming competitor to Nintendo's Mario, in Naughty Dog's Crash Bandicoot.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived. Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here. Check it out. What do you think about that? We got real-time, 3D, lush organic environments. How does that make you feel, buddy? Feel a little like your days are numbered? I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. You're hurting my elbow. Is that Italian? No, Bandicoot is an Australian name.
At the PlayStation Expo in 1996, PlayStation had announced a revision to the PlayStation controller. Mario 64 was revolutionary. This is in part due to the 360-degree movement that the Nintendo 64 controller offered to you, thanks to the analog stick. But games on the PlayStation were limited to 8. In response, PlayStation introduced a DualShock with 2 analog sticks, one on either side of the controller, to allow more freedom of movement and freedom of view. PlayStation was on the attack. They were ahead of the game, and if at any point they slipped behind, they came back with one better. Some titles took advantage of the format and hardware of the PlayStation by loading the game data to RAM, then allowing a user to put in a CD of their choice. This allowed a user to enjoy their own music. The first title to do this was Ridge Racer. Titles like VibRibbon used this feature in a unique way. VibRibbon generated new levels on the fly based on the music provided. Many third-party titles you grew up with on the Nintendo were growing up with you and were also transitioning from the Nintendo to the PlayStation, such as Mega Man 8, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and the most brutal of them all.
A battle between good and evil. A bitter war of love and hate. Final Fantasy VII is the biggest-selling game ever on PlayStation. Over 100 hours of the most compelling gameplay. This year's most anticipated release is Final Fantasy VII.
Not only was the title a clear advancement for a huge series many had grown up with and loved, Squaresoft marketed it as an attack on the Nintendo 64 and its cartridge-based limitations. And given that Final Fantasy VII was such a monumental title that is praised to this day, not only for its story, but its impact on gaming culture, it's clear to see that the Nintendo 64 was not going to be the king of the market. The Nintendo 64 kept a small library, but had some of the biggest, unmissable titles. Mario 64 was still the best 3D platformer around, and in 1998, the first 3D Zelda came out. However, PlayStation would challenge Mario 64's dominance yet again, this time with Spyro the Dragon, a true 3D platforming adventure. Konami would even publish Metal Gear Solid, which helped popularize the stealth genre and in-engine cinematic cutscenes. It was a huge success, and a huge title for the PlayStation. Square released a Parasite to the world, with Parasite Eve, marketing the title as a cinematic RPG, at least in Japan, and used a hybrid battle system for a unique horror title. Anything Nintendo had? PlayStation had something that was more mature, had more attitude, or had a deeper story. Nintendo was the child's console, PlayStation was the console to get when you've matured. Connectix was a large player in the Mac world, as in the 1990s they had created virtualizer software which would allow a user to run the Windows operating system on top of Macintosh systems. Seeing the success of PlayStation, they had wondered if they could make some money from virtualizing the PlayStation software stack as well. So in 1998, Connectix held a meeting with Sony to propose the idea of a PlayStation virtual game station. They requested access to the PlayStation BIOS so that they could start working on the product as soon as possible. However, Sony declined. Connectix decided to reverse engineer the BIOS, and a year later, the virtual game station software was shown on stage at Macworld, presented by Steve Jobs himself.
We're really excited about games, and again, our goal is to have the best game machine in the world. Now, this is another game machine. It's the most popular game machine in the world. Wouldn't it be great if we could play some of those titles too? Well, at Macworld today, Connectix is introducing the virtual game station. It is software. It is software that they're going to sell for $49 that turns your Mac into a Sony PlayStation. It plays a few hundred. It plays a few hundred of the Sony PlayStation games today, and I'd like to ask Phil to come back and give us a quick demo. Phil?
Hey, Steve. This is cool times 10, and the ability for very quickly, very affordably to take a Macintosh, my Macintosh, and run all the great PlayStation titles, just stick in my CD drive and start to play them. It's just a phenomenal idea. So I have here a Mac, and sure enough, no surprise running, is Connectix Virtual Game Station. Because we have USB, we have a lot of great new game controllers. I have a game controller that looks just like the kind of controller you'd use for these titles. And let me get it started again. So here I am in Crash Bandicoot. This is the #1 Sony PlayStation title shipping today. And with all the same kind of great performance, it's the kind of game my son would love. Allows me to jump, run around, use the same controls. And if I was any good, look. Now I'm so good at this that I don't have enough time to keep playing, or would run out of time. But there you go, working just like on a PlayStation, same controls, same title.
PlayStation had tried to take them to court, but Connectix would win. During the lawsuit, an injunction was granted, which prevented Connectix from shipping the PlayStation emulator. In which case, Sony would offer them money to become part of PlayStation, to prevent Connectix from being sold after the injunction expired. As things were being settled between Sony and Connectix, a new emulator would come into sight. Bleem allowed gamers to play their legally bought copies of some PlayStation 1 titles on Windows 95 or 98 PCs and the Dreamcast. This emulator was more advanced than the Virtual Game Station, as Bleem made use of 3D graphics hardware for rendering. Consumers who owned a PC and PlayStation could enjoy the games they already owned elsewhere with improved graphics, and long after the PlayStation came to an end. PC gamers could purchase and play games they never had access to before. And Sony would receive licensing fees for each and every game sold to use on the Bleem. It was a win-win for everyone. However, Sony fought against Bleem. The court sided with Bleem. Bleem had been making progress on the Dreamcast emulator and were in talks with Microsoft to make Bleem work with the up-and-coming Xbox. It may have been that Sony were worried that their PlayStation 2 would have one less selling point if your backlog of titles could have been played on any next-gen console or PC. Bleem would charge about $6 for a Bleem disc, and that would allow you to emulate a handful of titles, allowing them to further fund development of Bleem on consoles, and allow for near-perfect emulation, with improved anti-aliasing and at a higher resolution. Bleem would even be shown off at game shows, but Sony would attempt to get them removed. Sony eventually gave up on their attempts to win a court case, and instead engaged in a financial war, where they would build up Bleem's legal fees, with defense costs estimated at $1 million per patent. Bleem could no longer afford to pay their legal fees, and would have no time to further develop the Bleem software. Even though PlayStation lost every fight against Bleem, they won the war. With all of this success, Kutragi's dream and job were not only safe, he was promoted to the CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment, and giving him far more power and recognition inside the company.